Hello, friends. Welcome back to Unfeigned Christianity, where we seek to find culturally aware, biblically nuanced, and Jesus embodying responses to current day issues. I'm excited to have Byran Smucker on the podcast today, and we talk about stats and data. Now, the thing that got me interested in this conversation, particularly why I wanted to have Byran on, is that I have observed in just some very casual usage of data myself, running some surveys and so forth, I've observed that it's easy to misrepresent data. I can kind of manipulate it to say what I want to say. And I've noticed that in Christian discourse, I've noticed how Christian authors use data. And sometimes I generally don't trust, or I just take it kind of with a grain of salt. When somebody's written a book and they've done this massive survey, I'm somewhat skeptical because there's just so many ways that we can skew data and not be honest with it. So Byran Smucker was the only person that I'm aware of, that I know of, who has a degree in statistics, and kind of seeing some of his comments every now and then, he'll share an article or something that has to do with stats. It's like completely not my world, but kind of interesting to poke my head into every now and then. Byran has a PhD in statistics and operations research from Penn State, and currently serves as an associate professor, teaches of statistics at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And so he's got training in this, he has experience in it, and I just wanted to have him on and discuss statistics. Now, I do want to highlight, we did not get into this much, but Byran has a blog, and one of the things he's fairly consistent on his blog is kind of his yearly reading list. And so his blog, let me see if I can get the address correct. I think it's the Bylog Redux. The Bylog Redux. So by as in by, log redux.wordpress.com. I'll have it in the show notes as well. But he every year, at the very least, every year he posts the books that he's read and little thoughts about it. I really enjoyed his, on March 16th of this year, he posted an Anabaptist perspective on Jesus and John Wayne, which was basically an edited version of a speech that I think he gave at Miami University. He sat on a 3-person panel to give a short response to her talk. And so it's just kind of an edited version of his response to that. I found it really interesting and definitely recommend checking that out as well. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Byran Smucker. All right, we have Byran Smucker on the podcast today to talk about statistics. Byran, thanks for joining Unfeigned Christianity.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So I've known you were my first, I guess, celebrity crush or whatever when you sang with AHQ. I would
there you go.
Put you guys in my it wasn't a Walkman, but like the CD players that you could strap on the side, and I would pretend I was singing Byran Smucker solos and everything.
There you go. Well, AHQ got around quite a bit back in the, when was it? 2000s, early 2000s.
Yeah, early 2000s. Never did quite have the voice that matched it, but it was fun to pretend at least. So, but it's good to have. I've heard. I'm not even sure where I discovered this, that you had gone to college for statistics, that you were kind of in that field, and particularly in recent years, I have been more and more intrigued with statistics, or just how we use data, and kind of some of that coming from my own anecdotal experience in discovering that, I can, like, it's just kind of without knowing what you're doing, you can kind of misuse data easily. And so I've had an increasing interest in having somebody on the podcast and just talking about stats and how Christians interact with it in discourse. And so the fact that you're not only do you have a degree in it, you're teaching it, I believe, Miami University in Oxford. That's you're the only person I know or know of in that field, and so I reached out to you and was like, "Hey, could we have a conversation about this?" And you were kind enough to oblige. What, maybe just to get us started, what got you into statistics? Like, what inspired you to pursue a career of statistics?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you've done a lot of topics on your blog, probably statistics and data. Probably not going to get the most clicks for you. So, but that's okay. I'm happy to talk about it. I grew up enjoying school and enjoying math. And I had a couple of aunts who went to college, paved the way for me in that. And so I was just sort of like, okay, I'm going to go to community college. I'll go for engineering because engineering uses math. And eventually I went to Oregon State. I'm from the West Coast, from Oregon. And I got a degree in engineering, industrial engineering. And at that point I was like, well, I'm not real mechanical, so I didn't go on sort of that direction in engineering. And then like industrial engineering just wasn't quite what I was looking for. And so I was like, well, what parts of that do I like? And I like the statistics, sort of optimization, sort of the more mathematical parts of industrial engineering. And so I decided to just go for a graduate degree of some sort in statistics or related discipline operations research. And so, it was just sort of one of those things, Asher. It's like you have a vision for something and you try it and you're like, I'm going to keep trying until like a big roadblock is thrown up. And, I ended up going to Penn State and got a master's degree there. And I was like, well, let's try this. I'm enjoying, the studies and the research part, especially. Let's try it. And so, I ended up getting a PhD there. My wife is also from Pennsylvania. So we began dating, got married over that time. And then, so academic jobs are a bit strange. They're a bit few and far between. It's not like you go to a place and then just like, oh, I'm going to get a job, unless you are, clear at the top where you can sort of name your own job. But I applied to a bunch of places and ended up finally getting a call from Miami in March of 2010, I think it was. And so we moved out to southwestern Ohio, and I've been there ever since.
Oh, wow. So you've been teaching at the same school for 13 years now?
Yep. That's right. Yep.
Okay.
And in that time, I will just say a quick plug. So for those of you who may be, thinking about college, if you want to go that direction, over the last, I would say, like 5 to 8 years, stats has sort of blown up. You may have heard of terms like big data, data science, analytics, like all those buzzwords. Like they are permeating a lot of business, even science, like all those things. And so statistics is sort of the traditional version of those things. But even in our program at Miami, just a lot of growth over the last decade for sure.
Yeah.
So it's if you like math, if you like, but not super hardcore math. I have a cousin who is getting a PhD in math, I think, and that's another ball game. That's a whole nother thing. But if you're interested in math and interested in data, it's a great discipline.
Yeah. I've noticed even in the sports world, like a lot of sports in-game decisions are being driven by analytics and data and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I play and enjoy basketball, and famously Houston Rockets sort of did the thing where let's not shoot mid-range shots. Let's shoot either layups, like right close to the basket, or three-pointers because they're worth more. And of course, in baseball, that's a lot of analytics-driven strategy as well.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I mean, kind of a complete side note. I hadn't discussed talking about this, but something that I often hear when people are processing whether or not to go to college is this kind of uncertainty of they don't really know what they'd go for. And not only is this kind of my experience, but people like you who now have a career in your degree, the more I talk with people like this, I discover it's kind of this way that you didn't really know right out hand. You kind of, like you said, you had interest and you went down that road until there was a roadblock, until you lost interest and stuff. What is that process like? And for people kind of processing whether or not to invest in college, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple things. I would not recommend like just a blanket that everyone go to college, because, especially with some of the heritage that I have in the conservative Anabaptist tradition, there are ample, good job opportunities within those communities. I was just talking to someone yesterday, and I think it's fairly well known at this point that the trades, like there's a dearth of good people in the trades, like HVAC and electrician and plumbing and stuff. And those are more like, on the job training. There may be some academic training, but so, this is not to say that everyone should go to college, but if that is like an interest of yours, more academically minded, or even like you have an idea that you want to be a lawyer, or you want to be an engineer, or you want to be an educator or whatever, you don't have to have everything all mapped out, when you're 19 or 18. In fact, most people would not. So there's a balance there, Asher, because I would actually want my children and want myself to get some experiences. Like, if I'm not mistaken, you've gone to college later in life, and I can tell you for sure that the maturity that I have now, if I was going back to college, it would be a different experience. It would be a more enriching experience, honestly, than when I was 18 or 19 playing the game of being good at college, but not as interested in actually learning the stuff. You're interested in getting for me, is actually getting the grade, doing well, getting the credentials versus actually learning for the sake of learning and your future career or whatever. So yeah, I would not, even though in some way it's most efficient just to go straight out of high school, go to college and get your career start or whatever. I don't think that's probably the best route for many people, because there's so much richness that come from experiences in other cultures, just life experience, job experience, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I echo that. I wish it is tough when you're going to college and raising a family, tough with time, tough financially, but I don't regret the gap years, I guess you could say, of experiences. Yeah. Well, one of the things that kind of tipped me over the edge of having you on the podcast was just some discussion about how particularly Christian authors, as an author myself, I think about some of this stuff, how we interact with data, and specifically when we have a message that we're wanting to communicate and then create a survey or something to kind of show or prove that message. And just for my audience, a little bit of a background, I've run 3 reader surveys on my blog, usually anywhere between 200 and 600 participants. So it's nothing massive, definitely not scientific. It's just kind of get a feel for who's reading. But I've noticed that I can frame my data in a certain way. The largest, I split age categories. I split them up. I think it's like 18 to 25, 26 to 35, 36 to 45, so on and so forth. And the largest readership, or the largest category, is the 26 to 35 range. That's like, if you look on what's the kind of graph where you have the different,
like a bar chart.
A bar chart, yeah. However, so it was tempting for me to say most of my audience is 25 to 30 or 26 to 35. However, there were actually more entries from people older than that. they were just the specific categories were smaller. And so in recent, particularly the recent past couple months, there's been a conversation kind of on Christian Twitter that I've been following between a couple authors that both did surveys, and they're both kind of trying to negate the other person's survey. And and I just kind of follow it at a distance. And I guess I've grown a little hesitant to take Christian surveys super concretely anyways, just because they seem to often be done with a message they already want to communicate, as opposed to just kind of explore like some data that I've researched in college projects, like is just this group of people were literally just doing a study to see what the trends were, and then they wrote about what they found, and that has a different effect as opposed to doing a survey to try to show what you already think. And so that's kind of what got me thinking about stats and how we use it. And then you brought up a number of other things, just even how you've used stats to answer difficult questions about God, and how stats can point to, or I forget exactly how you word it, but how we as Christians can use stats to talk about the divine and to talk about faith with other people. And so, yeah, maybe I'll just open it wide up and be like, what direction do you want to take? Because that was really intriguing to me too. I had never thought about how the famous question for kids that I've done some teaching for kids who hate math, like, when am I going to use this? How am I going to use this? Or how does this glorify God? And just realizing that even numbers and stats and stuff can be a window into some of those difficult life questions that people will inevitably face is also intriguing to me. So I don't know. I'll just leave it wide open. Where would you like to go?
Well, you've hit on a lot of things there. Maybe I'll start with keeping on my advertisement for statistics a little bit. So I've thought quite a bit, since I've spent such a large amount of my life, in statistics and around data. I've thought quite a bit about how I can connect that, how it's connected to my faith. So let me just quickly say something about that, but then I get to the questions that you really have. So one way to think about what statistics is, if you're going to define it in just like a line, you could say it like this. You could say statistics is the use of data to make reasoned conclusions and decisions in the face of uncertainty. Okay, so using data to make reasoned conclusions and decisions in the face of uncertainty. And if you use that as a working definition, you break that apart, you can come up with three really important virtues that are really easy to connect to our Lord and King Jesus. The reasoned conclusions part has this idea of we're trying to get to the truth. So statistics is really an epistemology. It's a way to know things or try to learn things about the world. And so if statistics is about making reasoned conclusions, then it cares about getting at truth. If it cares about making decision making, one of the interesting things about stats is that it's not typically done for the purpose of the statistics themselves. It's almost always done in service of something else or someone else, whether it's business, science, government, whatever. And so statistics is a service discipline. And so service is right there, helping people make decisions. And then the last one, in the face of uncertainty, statistics is pretty unique in that way. And we try to quantify not only what we know, but what we don't know. And so we'll say, okay, here's our best guess as to whatever you're trying to estimate, some number. But then we're going to put an interval around that. A confidence interval is what we often call it. And that represents like our uncertainty about what we're saying is true. And so there's humility there. And so like these virtues of truth, service, and humility are just right baked into the discipline. And if you're a Christian, I can say those things to my non-Christian students. But if you want to it's not a very big leap at all to connect truth, to connect Christ with truth is the way, the truth, and the life, to connect service with Christ. He served, humbled himself and became a servant. And then, humility is there as well. Like Jesus, as, God coming to be man, humbled himself. And so, I think it's good for anyone in any discipline, in any field, whatever you're doing. I think it's worth taking some time and thinking how your field specifically connects to your faith, to Christ. And it turns out in statistics, it's not all that hard to do.
Have you been blessed by the work of Unfeigned Christianity? If so, I invite you to go deeper by becoming a member of Unfeigned Christianity on Patreon. All of our work is designed to help Christians find culturally aware, biblically nuanced, and Jesus embodying responses to current day issues. And we could not do it without the support of our members. As a part of the membership, you get to go deeper into sorting through what does it look like to faithfully embody Jesus in a world and in our culture and time. There are 3 main tiers of membership. If you become an advanced member, which is the middle tier, I will send you a free copy of Lori and Matt Krieg's book, An Impossible Marriage. This is the best marriage book I've read. If you become an advanced member this month, I'll send you a free copy. Now, here's the really good deal. When you do an annual membership, you get 16% off. If you'd like to see more details, just visit asherwhitmer.com/member.
So anyway, let me get to your question about the Christian discourse. It's interesting, your own experience about, framing the data that you've collected. So when you think about a survey, like we'll take your example there, the thing that makes it non-scientific is not the size of the survey. I don't know what your audience actually is, but 300 to 600 people, is probably adequate. And here's the big if the sample is representative of all of your listeners. That's the key. A self-selected survey, it probably is not representative. Because, you get nationwide surveys in the United States with just a few thousand. Okay, so they're going from a few thousand scaling up to millions. If you have a few hundred scaling up to, say, thousands, if you have that as your audience, the key is to get a representative sample. And that's the difficulty. The difficulty is you can't control who takes your sample, who takes your survey. And because of that, yes, it's probably, perhaps it's the more tech savvy, perhaps, that are taking the survey, or the people that are, maybe there's a personality quirk that makes some people more likely to take surveys than others. Like that's the difficult part. And yeah, so that's the one thing. That's a very key thing. Whenever you are trying to make a statement about a larger population, either you need to have a representative sample, or you need to be pretty fancy and careful. You need to really know what you're doing in terms of taking your sample and adjusting it. So like the political surveys, they are very sophisticated because they know that they don't get a representative sample. And so they know, for instance, they may sample Republicans on some question of interest. And they know that in this population, there's this proportion of male and this proportion of female, this proportion of each of the age categories. And so when they get their sample and they realize that their sample doesn't match up with what they know are the demographics of the population, then they can do some statistical adjustments to bring that into calibration, and so they can improve their estimates for the population. So that's one huge sort of statistical principle that plays in here. The second one is there's a famous truism that correlation does not equal causation, right? You've probably heard it, which is true. And this one is very hard for people that care about making a persuasive argument and are using data for that. It's very, very difficult to refrain from that in all cases. So what the idea there, correlation is not causation. I'll give you a silly example, okay? But and this is that ice cream sales and shark attacks are positively correlated. Okay,
Sure.
so ice cream sales and shark attacks are positively correlated, and on the face they're not related, right? Like what's going on there? There's definitely no causal, eating ice cream or buying ice cream and being attacked by a shark. But what's happening there is that there's another lurking variable there, right? And that is time of year or temperature, right? And so you buy more ice cream in the summer, you're on the beach more, exposed potentially to shark attacks. And so that's the thing that's actually driving the shark attacks, right? Not the ice cream sales. So that's a silly example, but anytime you have a study where you are tempted to make these causal relationships, unless you have a very experimentally controlled study, and that's another topic, but for most of the questions that we care about, we don't have that option. So let me give you an example. A number of years ago, I was in a social media conversation with someone about corporal punishments, spanking of children. And if I recall, this person was citing a study that showed that spanking was detrimental on average for kids. They had worse outcomes. And now, it may be the case that on average, kids turn out worse if they are spanked. The literature on that, I think, is fairly mixed. There's actually some evidence that there can be good outcomes, but my point here is that these studies are not experiments. It was not the case that you took 1,000 parents and you randomly assigned half of them to spank and half of them not to spank. And then you observed their children over the course of their life. That's not how these studies were done. Instead, they were done by interviewing or somehow studying a large group of families and taking a lot of information about them and following their children over time and seeing how their children turned out and also whether they spanked or not, practiced corporal punishment or not. And so, it could be that spanking caused this outcome that they saw that was negative, or it could be something else that is correlated with spanking that was actually driving it. And, as someone, I grew up with corporal punishment. I did not have bad effects as far as I can tell in my life. And so, I can pick apart a study like that, and I can say something like, well, it may be true that on average, this is the case that, children have bad outcomes on spanking, but it also could be the case that that's driven by something else. Maybe people that are spanking are angry, right? Maybe people that are spanking are not in a good emotional space. And so because of that, they are lashing out in abusive ways to their children. And so I can say, well, there may be another category of people not studied or not at least, pulled out by this study that are actually, quote unquote, doing it right. And in those cases, perhaps the children are better off for it. So these are some of the intricacies, and I didn't mean to really, this is not about spanking or not spanking, and I recognize the controversy there, and people disagree about that. But the point is that for complicated, issues, like say corporal punishment, or like gender dynamics, like climate change, like guns. These are extremely complicated situations, topics. And, if you're a policymaker in the government, I can see why it would be valuable to have some large study that gives you an overall idea of like whether this is good or bad, right? Or you might have your people look at the literature. There's tons of stuff on guns, tons of stuff on climate change, spanking even, there's a lot of stuff that's out there. And sometimes it's conflicting. Sometimes it's, one study will say one thing, the other study will say the other thing. And so to really get a handle on it, you need to survey the whole thing, right? And then you have to dig into like, why is it that this study was different in this study? Well, did they do it differently? It was a different population. And so what I want to paint a picture here is that you're asking too much of data, I think, to very easily, make a clear statement on very complicated issues.
Hey friends, this podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Dwell app. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Dwell audio Bible app, but this app is phenomenal. It's changed my life in several different ways. As a Bible college student, I do tremendous amounts of Bible reading throughout the semester, more than I normally do. And I'm not a fast reader. And so one of the ways that I have been able to keep on top of the Bible reading is through the Dwell app. One of the things I really like about it is there's very meditative, reflective music played in the background of the reader. So it's not dramatized. Some audio Bible apps are dramatized, and that's a little, I don't know, not my cup of tea. But it's a very calming and just peaceful way of having the Bible read to you. There's at least 15, I think there's close to 30 by now, different voices that you can choose from. There's many different translations you can choose from. For the ESV, I think there's maybe 2 or 3 voices, if that makes sense. But there's over 15 voices for sure. And so you can have a female voice, you can have a male voice, you can have a British accent, you can have an American accent, you can have a Canadian accent, or I like the British accent, so I listen to the Bible in the British accent, and it's been a really good way to keep on top of my homework. But also, I have found sometimes I'll be listening to audio Bible as I commute someplace, or as I'm doing some other work, or even in the morning. Sometimes it's hard to wake up, you're tired, and to sit down and read, it literally feels like an intellectual exercise. It's like school, like starting your day with school. And I love learning things, but I don't do well at starting my day with school. And so when you wake up and you're tired, but you want to meditate on the Word of God, to just put in my AirPods and listen to the Dwell app is an incredible way to start my morning, just in peaceful worship, meditation. I hear things differently when I hear it being read than when I read it. I personally think you should read and hear it both, but that's one thing I like about audio Bible is different things stick out that didn't stand out before. I'll listen to it as I'm going on a run or something, and I can't say enough good about the Dwell app. And so if you would like to take your meditation, your Bible reading to another level, you can also, if you're not able to sleep at night, you can put in your AirPods and listen to the scripture being read and fall asleep that way. I've used that at times as well. But you can start for free. There's a link in the description below, or you can go ahead and purchase the annual plan, which I have, and to me it's very much worth it, just in the way, a couple things, the way it helps me meditate and kind of a fresh view, a fresh experience with scripture, and then also the way it helps me keep on top of my homework. It's been very helpful for me.
Yeah, that's thanks for that. That's interesting, and it's also ironic because I just did an interview with a guy about spanking.
Okay.
So
yeah,
no, it was just the topic we were diving into was a totally new thing for me, and I had read something he wrote, and so was intrigued to have more conversation around it. But to your point, kind of a similar example maybe is I've written about my own journey, struggle with sexual addiction, and then finding freedom. And I've discovered in the years since publishing my book that roughly like 1 in 10 guys that I talk to face same-sex attraction. And that totally blew me away. I had no clue that was as prevalent of a thing. One of those friends I was talking with, and I mentioned that stat, and he's like, well, it's actually probably more like 1 or 2%. But because I'm in that field, I'm talking about it, I'm getting people wrestling with sexual struggles. And I think in doing more research just broadly in the culture at large, it is about 1, 2, maybe 3%, depending on context and stuff. So I could have walked away saying 10% of people face same-sex attraction, but that would have been a fairly significantly misrepresentation of the actual population. And that's kind of, if I'm hearing you correctly, that's kind of what you're getting at, because I was not constructing an experiment. I was just taking an observation based of what's coming to me, but because I'm in a particular topic, it's kind of biased.
Yeah, so this would be that first issue that I talked about, where the sample of people you're talking to is not representative of all people or all Anabaptists or whatever your population is. And so because of that, you're getting a biased estimate of the proportion that are same-sex attracted. And it's not so hard to caveat that and say, hey, I'm seeing, about 10% of the guys I'm talking to about this, face this. But then you caveat it and say, I'm not saying that this is, extrapolating to a larger population, because I recognize that I'm not seeing, I'm not randomly plucking, guys out of the population and then asking them. So that's really important to. Well, the other thing I would say about the like when you have something you are passionate about and you are advocating for or arguing for, I think it's very difficult actually to use statistics in a completely honest way, because, well, here's the question you could ask yourself. If you believe something and you're advocating for it, which is great, and then you look for statistics to back that up. Okay. So here's my question for you. If you found the statistics did not back you up, would you present them? If your answer is no, then I don't think you're using statistics, at least in an ethical way that, the discipline of statistics, I'm happy to say that they do take ethics fairly seriously. And, I have an ethical statement that the American Statistical Association put together. And, even though I have some fundamental disagreements worldview wise with where they're coming from, most of what they say in there, I fully agree with. And they say things like ethical statistical practice supports valid and prudent decision making with appropriate methodology. It says they seek to understand and mitigate known or suspected limitations, defects, or biases in the data. And they are very unswerving in terms of, you need to present what the data is saying, and you're not to twist it in any way. And so, even though it's strange, it to me as a statistician, it feels dishonest if you selectively share statistics. Now, this does not mean that if you advocate for a position and the statistics don't back you up, that your position's wrong, right? I think we have a tendency, probably a modernist tendency, to want to empirically validate what we believe. But it's not necessarily the case that all true beliefs will be empirically, validated, or it could be that there's some complexity that has not been accounted for, and so maybe it would be, validated if it was done the correct way or whatever. But just because you hold a belief and the statistics that you find on the internet or in the literature or whatever don't, align with that, doesn't mean that your belief's wrong, right? I think that this is a philosophical point, but there are deeper things about morality and ethics that transcend numbers. And so it's nice when, as an example, I believe very strongly in nonviolence and non-political work to change the world rather than using, coercion and politics. And so I could go out and search for, nonviolent movements and how they change the world, right? And I can find some examples of that. But what if, on average, it's better, by whatever measure you're talking about, it's better to use politics to change a culture than it is to use what I would see as the way of Jesus to do it. It doesn't mean that I'm gonna change my belief. My belief in Jesus' way of love and nonviolence is not open to an attack from empiricism, if you want to say it that way. And so I think a lot of our beliefs, especially ones that are core philosophical or religious beliefs, they may not be open to empiricism either. And I want to be careful there because, Christians can be accused, religious people perhaps, of just believing these things that are not good, and I can show you by the numbers. And so there's definitely a place for Christians to engage, critically with the sciences and the social sciences and these areas, and try to dig down and figure out, okay, this seems to show something at odds with what I believe, what's going on here. So I am not advocating for for an anti-intellectual bury your head in the sand sort of thing. I'm just arguing that we're probably over what's the word? We probably at times have given numbers and data and studies maybe too much purchase in our worldviews. Start with something that's deeper than that, and then go from there.
Yeah. Kind of to what you said earlier, we can be tempted to ask too much from statistics or data. Have you had opportunity, and if so, how do you help someone process, particularly? I mean, I know some people who struggle to come to faith in Jesus because of ways science or data doesn't always line up with the biblical worldview. How do you help someone who's grown up in the Christian world, but then confronts that data doesn't always tell their narrative? And this, it could get into a bunch of different things. One thing that I've dealt with I'm in Bible college, which is a kind of a basic bachelor's of biblical studies degree, but just discovering that the numbers in the book of Numbers don't always match what has been found archaeologically in the Middle East as far as the amount of people that were in the wilderness time of the Exodus. There should be a lot more graves and dead bodies kind of discovered and so forth. And so kind of processing that. I don't know. Have you had much experience with that with people, and how do you walk them?
Yeah. So, the big question regarding that would be evolution and the age of the universe and the age of the earth and all that. And things like archaeology in the Old Testament, that sort of stuff. So how I think about that is I'm with Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 that says, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we're wrong. And so that's the empirical part of Christianity, if you will, that I hang my hat on. And that one is, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then Christianity is wrong. If Jesus did rise from the dead, okay, then there is some reconciliation of these seemingly difficult questions. I mean, there's a tremendous number of questions that come up when you take a hard look at the Old Testament through 21st century eyes, in terms of how certain groups of people were treated in the law, how God's people, killed other ethnicities or other tribes, like that violence, all that stuff is difficult for many people. And so, I'm not personally equipped, at the moment anyway, to, go line by line and sort of refute those. There is lots of work that's been done on that, but I don't base my faith doesn't rise or fall on that. My faith rises or falls on Jesus, who I believe is the perfect image of God. And so some of those things from longer ago in the past, I would say we have a clearer picture of what God is through Jesus than we do through what it seems like God did, through his people in the Old Testament. And how the earth came to be, how the record of the Old Testament. So that's how I go about that. This also makes me think of that other topic that we were going to maybe touch on, and that is using a probabilistic framework to try to understand our beliefs. What I mean by that is, I think most of us come up and think, like, I either believe something or I don't. And we don't really frame it in this way, but it's like I either 100% believe something or 0% believe it. Like, I'm either sure that it's true or I'm sure that it's not. And what I understand is that if you have that framework about anything, like God existing, Jesus rising from the dead, the inerrancy of Scripture, whatever issue you're trying to wrestle with, if you have that 0-1 sort of dichotomous view, then what can you do when someone comes up with an argument that maybe you've never heard and that seems pretty convincing, right? There are some difficult arguments that challenge the theistic worldview. And so if you hear that, especially if you're off, you're 19-year-old and you're in college or whatever, the first time you've never heard this stuff, what do you do? And so what I would advocate is thinking about our beliefs less as 0-1 and more on a continuum. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that you can believe something without needing to have 100% certainty about it. So I can believe that Jesus rose from the dead, even though I'm not 100% certain that he did, right? And I can base my life on that. I can then also receive the witness of the Holy Spirit. I can receive the witness of the communities that I observe. There's all these other sort of non-scientific or non-data or non-mathematical, evidences that I can use that can help me understand what I believe. But then when I come up to a difficult argument, someone has a great argument that, the Gospels don't agree on the details of the resurrection, and if I'm in that 0-1 dichotomous mode, binary, 0-1 thing, then what do I do with that? Like, I either have to live in cognitive dissonance, right? Or I have to give up my belief, right? And I don't think either of those are healthy, and I don't think either of those are the way to think about it. And instead, we should think about updating our beliefs based on all the knowledge, all the information we have. And only if the weight of the evidence, the preponderance of the evidence was, so much that I couldn't sustain a belief, then I would feel, justified in changing my belief. But, someone given an argument that I'd never heard before, that shouldn't be enough to change my belief. Otherwise, my belief is very brittle, right? And it's not robust. It's not sustainable. So that's a way that I think about, especially as I engage with the world, because the wider world, man, if you've been on atheist Twitter, for instance, like there's a lot of people that are really smart and they have a lot of ideas and they have a lot of good arguments about this and other things that would attack Christian belief. And, we need to develop people that can weigh into that fray, that have a faith that's robust enough to withstand that. And that requires strong communities. It's not just, the way you think about stuff. It's also having strong communities but also, and it probably, for some of us, it probably requires education too, some formal education. Not everyone, but some. And because I don't know about you, Asher, but I do want to change the world. I mean, I know that I can't on my own, but I want to be a part of a movement that's changing the world. And if I'm a part of a movement that is just shrinking in the shadows, trying to, protect what we have, that's not satisfying to me, because it's too defensive. It's not offensive enough. And this little thing about epistemology and probabilistic thinking, that's one little part of how I think about engaging.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That's good. I'm curious. I was going to ask you, and maybe I will just now, like what books you've read. I remember seeing, I think it was on Facebook or something, you were asking about Rodney Stark and his. Have you read any of his work, like The Rise of Christianity?
Just that one. Yeah.
Just that one. What did you think of that book and kind of his use of probabilities to essentially defend the rise of Christianity? I'm not sure that he was actually a Christian when he wrote that or when he started it, but
one of the things I remember about that book is he or a colleague or someone tried to model the growth of Christianity, like over the generations. What I took from that, though, is that he was actually arguing that it wasn't unexpected. So one of the arguments that Christians use is that the growth of Christianity was unexpected, and it was faster than it was expected, or something like that. So I'm not sure if I recall him making the argument that it wasn't unprecedented, a movement like that. But yeah, I mean, he's a sociologist, if I recall, and so they definitely would tend to use data in their work. And, I think those things are valuable and interesting. But again, and it's weird because I didn't expect to come on your podcast and sort of almost downplay the importance of statistics and data. But when you think of it in relation to these like deeper beliefs that we have, that people have, it's often like when you hear a Christian and an atheist debating, sometimes there's a distinction that needs to be made between the physical and the metaphysical, right? The physical, and if something is physical, then it is open to empirical study, typically, and that's where statistics can be of great benefit. But then there are some things that I think are fundamentally beyond nature. They're supernatural or metaphysical. And those things, while they can be bolstered by certain scientific or empirical insights, they rest on they're like, you can't prove them via, the scientific method. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make, is that, don't be intimidated, say, by the scientific approach or the empirical approach to be argued out of positions that are not even subject to that sort of scrutiny. Make sure that your metaphysics, the things you believe about things beyond nature, like whether God exists and how God works in the world, those shouldn't be subject to, or I don't know. I'm sort of thinking a little bit off the top of my head here, Asher, and so I'm a little worried that I'm dualizing Christianity and our lives. I do not believe in a dualism that says here's the scientific part and here's the Christian part. I think it's all one reality. But I think there is we should have a recognition that some things are fundamentally beyond nature, and thus are not scientific. Science only deals with things that are in the natural world and subject to that measurement.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks so much for taking the time, and I enjoyed the conversation. I basically get guests on that I enjoy, regardless of whether I think everybody else will enjoy or not.
Yeah.
But there's a number of things would be fun to dive into further, but this is good for now. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for having me, and I enjoyed it as well.
And thanks for listening to this episode with Byran. I hope you enjoyed it. For the sake of time, I'm cutting out the last 20 minutes of our conversation, and those who are members of Unfeigned Christianity on Patreon can access the expanded version. I trust you have found the conversation this far helpful and inspiring and even just thought-provoking as we learn how to interact honestly with data. We do get into some conversation. He just briefly brought up like how he interacts with data when it doesn't actually back up his belief system, and what do you do with that? And I kind of bring up this whole conversation of deconstruction and just how like when we bump into specific statistics that don't prove our Christian worldview, what do you do with that? Or when we're studying scripture and we discover there's things that archaeology is finding that doesn't quite match what we just kind of thought or assumed from scripture, how do we navigate that? Also, I had conversation about kind of his perspective on COVID and how Christians use data during COVID and how he navigated that, as well as just what does it look like for Christian authors to use data honestly in their writing. So if you're interested in the final 20 minutes of this conversation, visit either the link below or just go to asherwhitmer.com/member and you'll see the various sign up options there. Now, to access this expanded version podcast, there are 3 tiers. All you need is the lowest tier, which is $10 a month. You get access to all expanded podcast episodes as well as deep dive essays. So if that interests you, if you'd like to hear more of our conversation, check out the link below. Thank you.